for everyone who doesn't know Majesty of Reason, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so like you said, I've got a channel called Majesty of Reason that everyone should go immediately subscribe to and turn on the notifications bell for. I basically produce content on philosophy. So I make lecture videos of my own. I host discussions between different philosophers, talk through papers that I've published and books that I published, etc. So yeah, it's all about philosophy, mainly philosophy of religion, some metaphysics, and a lot of stuff that's like critical thinking and philosophy and argumentation and reasoning and things like that. So anyway, that's Majesty of Reason. That's my popular level stuff. I also have a blog by the same name, Majesty of Reason. And then, yeah, on the scholarly level, I publish books and articles and things like that. So of most relevance here would be, let's see if I can point the right direction. Okay, I did. I pointed the right direction. It's that book up there called Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. It's published with my co-author, Dr. Daniel Linford, and it's published with Springer. So that's of great relevance to...
Fancy. That's what it is. That's fancy. That's a very, that is. So yeah, I mean, that's amazing. I mean, the fact that you published on what we're discussing right now, really, in many ways, like classical theistic proofs. So that really does make you an expert on the topic, and that makes my position all the more dubious when I'm counteracting your position on Thomas on Aquinas. So right, if just to sort of draw back to my original response to your response, which is no doubt a response to something else. And well, infinite regresses and all this. Essentially, the active content, the main point of contention, from what I remember, is that in terms of the argument from change, you believed it to be a rejection of ontological pluralism. Was it? Oh no, that it requires ontological pluralism.
There we go, yeah.
Which I don't actually think I agree with. In general, and even when we talk about ontological pluralism, so I was talking to some of my analytic friends, because we don't usually use this terminology in the circles I sort of with Hegel, and we'll be using like ridiculous words. This is far too well defined. The issue is that, from what I understand of ontological pluralism, it's the different types of existences, right? Different modes of existences. Now, I know in the comments section, you said that, this isn't, under ontological monism, you could have different kinds of existence, but there wouldn't be different existences. Well, here's my hiccup here. Because if Aquinas is an ontological pluralist, then you're saying you'd be arguing for different kinds of existences. But then he says that existence is the Father, and that is God. It's a part of God, and that existence or being comes from God. And so all existence is a kind of subset within God. So I would put Aquinas as a kind of a panentheist, where, like there is God, and then the universe, which is its own being, but is always a subset of that same being, which is why it can always be traced back to God in a way which gives priority to God. So how would you respond to that? Like, just to sort of, before I go on and on.
Yeah, no, that's good. So, of course, controversies here about how to articulate the argument precisely. I was kind of concerned with Ben Shapiro's and ultimately Ed Fazer's rendition. So, that's not going to be the same as any other scholar's rendition or any other scholar's attempted rendition of Aquinas' own argument, So yeah. You just have to keep in mind that there are different renditions here, and it's okay if certain objections apply to some and not to others. I was mainly concerned with the one that Fazer develops and the one that Ben kind of co-opts for his own uses. So that's just a clarificatory note at the beginning. Let's just keep in mind that there are different kind of forms of the argument.
That's fair, yeah.
Yeah. Now, onto your specific question. So you're certainly right that for Aquinas, God is, at least in some sense, being itself. He is the ipsum esse subsistens, the subsistent act of being itself. And every other thing exists by virtue of God or because God causes them to be at any moment of their existence. So you're certainly correct that there's a dependence relation there between the various different beings in our experience, on the one hand, and God on the other. So that's certainly correct. Now, what I think is important to note here is that I don't think that dependence is going to involve Aquinas in saying something like, is like a panentheistic model. As I understand panentheism, and this is another word that's really difficult to define, but as I understand it, usually panentheism is a view that the universe and created reality is in some manner in God. God is more than the universe. He's distinct from the universe. He's distinct from created reality. But created reality is in some sense in God, but God is nevertheless more than it. So it's kind of like a sub-part of God, or it's kind of like a portion of God in some manner. It's in God. It's contained in God in some way. Now, for Aquinas, he's going to want to reject that sort of view. So even though he maintains that everything is dependent on God and they receive their existence from God, they're not contained in God, because that would make God sort of like a composite in some sense. Things would be in him and he'd be kind of built up out of these parts, as it were. So he's not going to want to say that these things are in God. Instead, for Aquinas, everything in God is identical to God. He has this kind of radical divine simplicity. So this might actually be a kind of, I actually suspect that there's an underlying agreement between us here. I think the main point here is that for Aquinas, yes, God is being itself, and everything else exists by virtue of, being caused by God. I think we agree with that. I think we can ultimately agree, that the created realities don't exist within God or inside of God in some manner.
Well, I don't know. Because what is the created reality for Aquinas ultimately is the archetypical idea in the mind of God. This form. And so I would say that it doesn't exist within God in the sense that it is a composite part of God, 100%. Like, we can absolutely agree with that. He definitely wants God to be purely simple, absolutely simple. But then from his simplicity produces particular ideas which are separable from him, which he could then, cease to sustain, and it is through this act of sustenance, like the passive power, I think he describes it as, rather than the active power, and that he could just simply forget about whatever it is in creation. I'm not going to have that universe anymore, or even it never existed in the first place because it's atemporal and it's just mind bending. But so God is necessarily prior in his eternality, but I don't think that this goes against panentheism, and so maybe we're just looking at panentheism in a different way, where I see like this is a subset, if you will, and that God is the set of sets, and the set of sets is essentially in control of whatever set then is the subset within it. And so it's not that he's identical with the set within it, but the identity of him is whatever he chooses to actualize.
Yeah, I think we're actually using just like different language to describe the same phenomenon. So I think we're kind of in agreement here ultimately. Like, I would just use the language of, God causes these things under Aquinas' model, under this, broadly Thomistic, classical theism. God causes these things to exist, and they exist only insofar as God causes them. God is identical to being itself or something like that, and these other things exist in virtue of their relation to God. I think that's really the core here, and we agree on that core. It's just I think that we're just describing it differently, and that's okay,
Yeah.
So I ultimately think that there's a kind of underlying agreement on the point about how to characterize Aquinas' view substantively, prescinding from our precise vocabulary and language. I think substantively there's a kind of a core agreement here. Between us on how Aquinas kind of characterizes the relation.
I would agree. It's just how this then impacts, downstream from that, how this impacts whether he's a ontological monist or whether he's a pluralist. And I would, and I would say that this is a monistic position in which all of the existence that each object has is the subsistence within God. It's the passive power of God providing his being into because remember, there's no matter either. Matter doesn't exist. He rejects prime matter. This idea that there is this sort of thing which could be molded or something as a separate existence, and instead it is like it is the form itself that has been made concrete in the act of creation. And in which case, I think that if what he's saying is that it is the power of creation which is manifesting this being, and that in that act we have this different kind of being. So it is part of God in the sense that it is God has created something within himself, but that is like a separate thing. But that's still a monistic conception of existence, rather than a pluralistic, which would be like there are numerous different kinds of, different existences, if you will.
Yeah, good. So this is, I think, we've pinpointed the kind of crux now with respect to this first kind of broad point. So for me, here's how I'm kind of coming at this. I think that we can't have a kind of monism on this view by my lights, because the created being, right, the creature's being, is caused, right? It's caused to be. It's brought about. Whereas God's being is not caused. It's not brought about. So minimally, God's being cannot be the same as created being. Of course, created being exists in virtue of God's being. God's being, which is his creative act, that causes them to exist. But their being is not one and the same as God's being, because something is true of their being that isn't true of God's being. Their being is caused, it is brought about, it is dependent, it is finite, it is delimited. Whereas God's being is not caused, it is not brought about, it is not finite, it is not delimited. So for me, it does seem to be the case that there's kind of plurality of beings here, as it were. And by beings, I mean modes of being. I'm not talking about the entities. We're talking about the existence of the entities.
Yeah, the existence itself. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think there has to be some kind of pluralism here, to me.
See, I would say otherwise, because I would say I look at this from the kind of position of, let's say, like, later on, that's explained, I think, better with, like, that's why I brought Kant into the video and why I brought Hegel into the video, where I think they explain it better than Aquinas, which I hope so. It was like many hundreds of years later. But the idea is, when you have the universal, the particular is actually a limitation of the universal. I mean, it's the same thing as like, the way that Plato thought of this was that, an object partakes in the form, and the form is the universality of that thing. And then that builds up to the universality of the one, which has in many ways sort of moved through Neoplatonism into Augustine and then into Thomas Aquinas in the divine simplicity. And I think it's quite a similar position. I think that the idea of the particulars and these particular modes of being, or these particular beings, is just a limitation of the being, which in priority is the eternal one. It is the eternal simple being, and which is why he's the Father. And that everything else is simply limitations of his being, which he chooses to limit himself to, limit parts, a part of his existence into a form, an idea, an archetypical idea, which he then makes concrete in time. And so I would say that as a monistic part, and we don't have to agree. It's not like we have to like come out of this and like Thomas Aquinas. But I would say this is a monistic conception, because when you look at the like, even when he talks of agents, he talks of particular agents, and then he talks of the universal agent. And this relationship between particular and universal is what really inspired the debates in the time of this medieval philosophical period. So I see what you're saying. Like, obviously that beings, that concrete instantiation is limited 100%. But I think that limitation is it's a limited, it's a limitation of what, and that is the set, which, at each point you're going to have to explain it by going causally upwards or backwards. And that is why he's making this argument that you can end up tracing being back to an unchanging origin.
Yeah. I mean, just going back to previously what you said, we're both here just kind of to get greater understanding of the issues and to help the audience get a greater understanding. It's fine if we don't agree at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
Or, if we don't end up changing minds. Really, the purpose of this is to get better understanding of the issues, better understanding of the argument, and just to try to increase our stock of knowledge about reality. So
100%.
So yeah, we're totally on the same page there. So I guess I would want to resist characterizing the relationship between God and creatures as same or relevantly similar to that between, let's say, universals and particulars. Like, universals, as I understand them, it's going to be one thing, numerically one thing, that is shared in common among various different particulars, various different things. So we've got like the form or the property or the universal of blackness, which is shared in common among my marker cap here, my phone here, and the wall there. So there's kind of one entity here that is shared in common among different things. I think Aquinas will want to resist that God is like shared in common among creatures. Instead, actually, let me see if I have the book. Yeah, okay, so it's in Aquinas' Way to God. It is by Gavin Kerr. He's one of the foremost one of the foremost exponents of Thomistic thought and things like that. He points out in that book that Aquinas, for the being that is common to creatures, is what's called esse commune. And that's different from the esse tantum of God. Esse tantum, a pure esse, is God's, unlimited being. And that's not one thing that's like numerically shared in common among distinct particulars. Distinct particulars, instead, they share in common esse commune. Now, of course, that esse commune exists in virtue of God, right? There's a relationship there, and a dependence relationship. So that's where we got that kind of agreement earlier on. But it's the esse commune that's shared in common. It's not as the esse tantum, God's being, which is shared in common. If we want to resist, then treating the being of creatures and its relationship to God's being as relevantly analogous to the relationship between particulars and universals. So Gavin Kerr, or Kerr, I don't quite know how to pronounce it, but he's one of the foremost exponents of Thomistic thought. And this is his book, Aquinas' Way to God, The Proof in the De Ente et Essentia. He points out on page 155 that everything other than God is such that it is a composite of essence and esse, and as such is wholly other than esse tantum, which is God. God is being itself, esse tantum. So these things are wholly other than God, and they're a composite of their essence and their existence. Their existence goes into their makeup. It makes them up. It's a component part of them. God, however, which is identical to God's existence, right? God's not like a part of created reality. Aquinas says in the Summa Theologiae that God is not a part of created reality. But the esse of beings, as Gavin Kerr points out, their existence, their esse, their active existence is indeed a component part of them. They are composites of essence and existence. And so their existence cannot be God's existence, right? Because their existence is a part of them, but God isn't a part of creatures. That's one point to note here. But another point is that Gavin Kerr also points out on page 155 that the esse that creatures share in common, right? So remember I was talking about universals being shared in common or held in common among numerically distinct particulars. What's held in common among creatures is this esse commune. And that's the esse that they have and that they participate in. Now, that esse in turn depends on and participates in esse tantum, of course. But that esse tantum is crucially distinct from that esse commune. That esse commune is what is shared in common among creatures. But that is an esse or a being that participates in God's being. It's not the one and the same as God's being, at least according to one of the foremost proponents and exponents of Aquinas' thought and Aquinas' views, Gavin Kerr. Now again, I recognize that there may be divergent characterizations of Aquinas, but at least following some of the mainstream scholarship, I would argue that my kind of position here is at least supported by some of that mainstream scholarship.
Oh yeah. I don't think that your position is like radically unheard of. If anything, I think that my position is probably the more so. For example, in later in the conversation, I'm going to disagree with. Somewhat agree, but also disagree with William Lane Craig's reading of Thomas Aquinas. So it's not as if when you're reading these things yourself, everyone has their own interpretation and they do vary, and that's the whole point of peer review and having conversations like this, so that we can say, well, what does Aquinas mean by this? What would this entail? And so on. Anyway, so 100%. I'm not saying that your position's unfounded. I do still disagree with it though, and I think that there's specifically for the fact that obviously esse commune is dependent upon esse tantum, and that shows that it is a limited form in and of itself of being itself, and that the unity of God is essence and existence as a single perfect whole, as this simple unity, whereas in esse commune each particular being, which is sort of universally, which is part of this genus, if you will, of created beings, exists in something like time or space, or in limited ways in which Aquinas would point towards as having duration, and if we have duration, and even if you point towards eternity, even at the point in which you enter the afterlife, it's still separate from the eternity of God. Even if it's everlasting, it's not the eternal existence of God. So you're 100% right there in saying that there is a different kind of existence there, in the sense that it is a different way of existing. 100%, 100%. The thing is that I would say that the existence itself is still God. It's that the universality, and if we're related to universals and particulars, in Aristotle, the particular is the most accidental. And the more you build up into universals, the more substantial it becomes. And each universal exists as sort of separate, but then, part of a greater sort of universal, a greater genus, and so on. So you've got, humans are part of animality, and then animality is part of, let's say, nature, and then, you build up until you end up with, existence and so on, of created reality. I would say that those are, in terms of Kant or Hegel, if you look at, or even Aristotle, the relations between, like, in terms of the three figures of logic, if you have universality, then you have particularity, you have the synthesis, which is either, depending on if you read Kant or Hegel, individuality or singularity. And singularities are, for example, species essence. Humans are a universal, but it's a limited universal. It's not absolute universality. So it's like a form, but it's not the form of the good in Plato. It's a subsisting form of that form, which makes all of that forms be. And it would be the same, I would say, in terms of esse commune, in which it is a subsisting part of being, a subsisting limited form of being, which can be characterized as a genus, which is the existence of created creatures. But that existence is in and of itself only part of existence, which is God.
Yeah, well, see, this is where language gets trippy, because we wouldn't want to say that it's part of it, right? Because the existence is God, right? So it can't be a part of God.
No, but it partakes. It would be it partakes. Yeah.
That's why I think. That's why I think now I'm agreeing, right? Because I agree that there's a kind of relation of dependence there. They exist in virtue of God. So there's a relation of dependence there. But I think what really matters is that there's still distinct ways of being. There's distinct modes of existence. And if we, I think that's where I'd.
But 100%. But I mean, remember, it's like a priority relationship in the sense that it's even in relation to time, and this might actually be a nice way to segue into the next point, which was on whether Aquinas is an eternalist or whether he's a presentist, and I think Aquinas is an eternalist. And I know William Lane Craig says that Thomistic philosophy implies eternalism, but he didn't believe that Aquinas knew that he was implying that. I think he did. I think
I agree with William Lane Craig.
Yeah, I think that he did know, and I've actually got a nice little point on time, which I think is nice. It's our question. I think it's question 46, Article 1, whether the universe of creatures always existed. And he says they don't have to, they're not eternal, and so they don't have to always exist. And then he says to objection 7, which is that they, is an argument that they must always exist, is to say that, as stated in the physics, like Aristotle's physics, before and after belong to time, according as they are in movement. Hence, the beginning and end in time must be taken in the same way as movement. Now, granted the eternity of movement, it is necessary that any given moment in the movement be a beginning and an end of movement, which need not be a movement which need not be a movement if movement be a beginning. The same applies to the now of time. Thus it appears that the idea of the instant now as always the beginning and end of time presupposes the eternity of time and movement. Hence Aristotle brings forward this reason against those who asserted the eternity of time but denied the eternity of movement. And I think what he's pointing out is that every single moment is in time is a sustained point of a now, and that it all comes from the priority of the eternal now, which is God, and that's God's experience of time. And so each is a subsisting part. And so it's eternal in the sense that, it is not eternal in the sense of the way that Aquinas would talk of God being eternal, that it has always and will always exist, and so on. It's subsistent upon God, but it is it is a specific being which does exist even once the moment has passed, because it is a particular instance of time. It is a now, and so it's a beginning and an end. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's interesting. So in order to comment on that passage, like, I'm very careful about these sorts of things.
100%, yeah.
I'd have to sit down, honestly, and kind of read the passage and look at some commentaries from other thinkers and things like that. So I'm not going to be able to arbitrate on that passage here.
No, it's fine. That's fine.
What I do want to say is there are at least other passages, at least in Aquinas' corpus, that do seem to be suggestive of presentism. You know, and he talks about like movable now in Summa Theologiae, the Prima Pars, question 10, article 4. And also in Disputed Questions on Truth, he writes that he talks about, although a contingent thing is not determined as long as it is future, it only yet exists. And then as soon as it is produced in the realm of nature, as soon as it has a kind of reality in nature, it has a determinate truth. Then he goes on to say, it is in this way that the gaze of divine knowledge is brought upon it. Mm-hmm. And a little later, he goes on to say that although, this is a direct quote from him, although a contingent does not exercise an active existence as long as it is a future, as soon as it is present, it has both existence and truth, and in this condition stands under the divine vision. He seems to be saying in both of these passages, he seems to be committing to the idea that future things don't exist. They don't exist, at least as concrete objects, until they become present, and that's when they take on their active existence. And that seems to be at least in tension with, well, I mean, that's not compatible with eternalism. So there are at least other passages, at least, that seem to be suggestive of it. And here, one thing before I turn it back over.
No, it's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
We should recognize that, you know, these historical thinkers have huge corpuses, huge bodies of text, and sometimes they will say something in one area, and it could be in tension with what they say in another area. And it's a task of historical philosophy to try to comb through what were their views. Are these really in tension? Were they refining their views later on? Did they just contradict one another and did they not recognize it? So this is a difficult task. So I just wanted to recognize that.
100%. I think that's fair enough. Like, obviously, like, I don't think we're going to reconcile Thomistic philosophy in this conversation, you know, especially, you know, we're not going to, I'm glad that we've sorted that out. We know exactly what Thomas Aquinas said, you know, in terms of, like, I mean, the Summa Theologica just on its own is huge. It's huge. But I do think that, and I know the point in which you're referencing, but remember that he's also talking about truth from the perspective of individuals arguing, and he's actually replying to arguments that were being made, which were arguing about whether truth changes. And he says two things. He says that truth doesn't change from God. God is truth, and so there is this everlasting truth, this eternal truth, and then there is truth from our perspective. And truth from our perspective is based upon the contingency of future events that have yet to occur. And so he's acknowledging that there are from our perspective, the future is indeterminate. But from God's perspective, it's already simultaneously taken in the now, which is why it exists in the divine gaze of God. But that means that, and you know, to bring this in even into the point of the theory of relativity. When you discuss the theory of relativity and the continued existence of, beings that, well, like time, we'll say like time intervals, like T1, T2, T3, so on. I don't think Aquinas is actually denying that. If anything, I think he's affirming it. I think that he's just pointing out that from T1, T2 is indeterminate, from the perspective of that individual looking forward causally. And I think that this actually totally connects, I think perfectly aligns with Einstein anyway, because in fact, Joe goes on to talk about this static block of space-time spoken in Einstein's theory of relativity.
Eternalism is a formidable view with lots of arguments in its favor. So for instance, general relativity, which is exceptionally empirically confirmed, seems to treat spacetime as a four-dimensional manifold, in accord with eternalism.
Einstein's talking about the relative simultaneity of two objects as well, like, through dependent upon where your position in space-time, but only upon a causal light cone. So remember that like causation is still necessarily affirmed in Einstein as well. He never denies like a causal, linear causal link, and in fact, he was very adamant against theories which proposed temporal paradoxes, since they would break essentially physics. He was like, no, this is just it cannot happen, which is one of the reasons I think he was against like quantum, like some sort of quantum stuff. But I don't think he's seen like maybe the developments of physics today. But but if you look at this sort of light cone. This light cone is just what Aristotle and Aquinas would have thought anyway. It's motion, and it's the uniformity of motion, since you take c to be the constant, which is the speed of light, and that's essentially the sort of max. It's sort of like how fast will time progress is relative to how fast something can move in relative to space. And I think that is like essentially what, Aquinas and Aristotle was saying. It's just way more simplistically. I don't think they knew that. That's something I can honestly say. I do not think that Aristotle, Aquinas had any idea about light cones, theory of relativity, or anything like that. I'm not saying that, here's Thomas Aquinas, 700, 800 years ago, coming up with the theory of relativity.
I would be surprised if anyone could say that. But,
yeah. But I do think that it shows that it's not incompatible with eternalism. And I do think that would need to consider the differences in truth as we perceive it versus the differences in truth as itself, as God perceives it. And I think that is even in that passage as the divine gaze being separate from the gaze of humanity.
Yeah. So I actually have a kind of leaning on what Aquinas' view of time is. And it really is a kind of, this is my reading of Aquinas, and there are various other scholars that adopt this as well. But it is a kind of fragmented view of reality. So yeah, actually from the perspective of creatures, it really is true. Like presentism really is true. So from our perspective, like it really is the case, like indexed to our perspective, that the future doesn't yet exist. But indexed to God's perspective, future and the past and the present all really do exist. His gaze is full and encompassing, and it's all kind of, as it were, simultaneously present to him. He uses that language. So I actually lean towards that kind of view of Aquinas, where from God's perspective, all of times are equally real. But from creatures' perspective, not all times are equally real. So it's a kind of fragmented view of reality. What's real kind of depends on what your kind of quote-unquote frame of reference is. Whether you're a kind of created thing within time or whether you're God. Now, set aside whether or not that's like independently implausible, just set that aside. Just in terms of Aquinas' view, I actually lean toward thinking this is Aquinas' view. Now, how does that relate to the argument from change? Well, to me, I think if that's Aquinas' view, it still seems to me that the kind of central criticism that we get up and running is still, or that we level is still going to get up and running, right? Because so long as you grant that presentism is true, at least from the perspective of creatures, there really is this kind of dynamism from the perspective of creatures. And so there are these, the future truths, the future objects really do come into existence and then pass away, at least from the perspective of creatures. And that's going to involve the actualizations of potential. Some things really are potential from creatures as perspectives, and then they transition to a state of actuality. But by contrast, eternalism, as I was using it in the video with Stephen, and as philosophers use it, eternalism is a statement about, even from our perspective, right? All times are equally real, just simpliciter. It's not a fragmented view of reality. And so you would still have this challenge for the view, right? Because Aquinas has this presentism from the perspective of our creatures, but eternalism from the perspective of creatures is going to be incompatible with presentism from the perspective of creatures. So I do still think it's going to be in tension, at least with eternalism from the perspective of creatures. And you can mount a lot of arguments for eternalism from the perspective of creatures. It's these various considerations from, well, there are philosophical considerations from truth making and so on, and then there are these scientific considerations from, as we pointed out in the video, special and general relativity. So yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to interject. This is a really good conversation. So thank you for setting this up, and I'm enjoying it. And I think the audience will really.
I'm enjoying it too. I don't think you often actually get to have a philosophical discussion which is true. Like a lot of the time, it ends up being like, especially when you get this level of philosophy, it just ends up being a philosophy lecture. I find where you just sort of explaining philosophy to someone, and you're like, okay, but you haven't read anyone, and so I'm just like translating whoever, like and it comes to the point where it's like I can't translate Hegel one more time. But I'm gonna try again anyway. Like, but anyway, so in reference, so if I just quickly summarize your point. So what you're saying is that you think there is a fragmentation between in Aquinas, which presents eternalism from the point of God and presentism from the point of humanity. I actually think that there is, like, in Aquinas is reconciling the presentism that is in Saint Augustine with the eternalism that is in Aristotle. And so I don't think he thinks they're contradictory at all, which is why he agrees with Aristotle in the physics. This idea that Aristotle thought of this, ever moving being, this constantly self-actualizing being, with this simple, this simplicity, this divine simplicity that is Platonic and like Neoplatonic that is in Augustine. And so Aquinas is really looking at this from the perspective of, okay, we are particulars which are part of God in this sort of changing, moving process, which is already completed from God. But when we look at time, and this is the point, he says, like, time, we don't really, the universal being doesn't imply time, but the particular being doesn't imply time. And when he says that that every moment is a beginning and an end, I think that and that this does imply, he says, this appears the idea of the instant now as being always the beginning and end of time, and presupposes the eternity of time and movement. So what I think he's actually saying there is that if each instance of time being a now implies a present reality of being eternally present, this eternality of time, but that each moment is a limited being within time. And so you end up with, like, T1 is not T2, but T1 and T2 both imply, like Tn, which is the eternity of time, and this priority of a being which creates time. And he talks about time being created. But he says that it is, we shouldn't look at this obviously as we should look at this as like the divine authorship, and that he's the sufficient cause, and that this is all preconceived. And I think that's the relationship that he's actually pointing out. He's like, there is the truth, and then there is the truth from our perspectives, and they are unitable. Like they can be united, but only through the grace of God. In terms of, like, eventually we move through the divine wisdom, and it's this attempt for human reason to sort of wrestle with this divine reason. I think this is one of the few things that me and Ben maybe even agree with, where he's like, we wrestle with the divine logic, and it's like, yeah, and I mean, it's not Ben really. I mean, that's actually it's the story of Jacob and everything. Really, I mean, this is again. I'll throw Ben under the bus. I don't care, but I think that this is this issue where it's mind bending for us to perceive of the eternality of time in the present and its continual changing as being united. And the author that I think, surprisingly, I think that says this the best is Hegel. And he says this in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And he says, these are the moments of which the reconciliation of spirit with its own consciousness proper is composed. Spirit is essentially the foundations of all reality. So each moment of spirit, each individual historical moment is a point in a unified whole. So it's reconciling with its own consciousness proper is composed. By themselves, they are single and separate, and solely their spiritual unity that constitutes the power of this relation, of this reconciliation. So they are single, separate moments which exist different from each other, but they are reconciled into the whole, which is spirit. The last of these moments, however, is necessarily the unity itself, and it is evident it binds them all into itself. And so what he's saying is that the last, the telos, the end, the last moment is the unity of time itself. And it's not to say that there is this, I think people want to see it as this sort of like timeline where it's like there is this beginning and then there is this end. What he's actually saying is that, and he points this out, he actually describes the middle term, which is this movement of time, as infinite, because it's a linear progression. It's just plus one, and the same as Aquinas. But the reconciliation of this, of consciousness or being, if it was Aquinas, it's changing in time as itself is this unity of the eternal and the of time itself. So we'd say, like, when we talk about time, we talk about a sequence, but we're talking about that as atemporally, because we're saying if we say T1 and T2, then we can't be in T1 or T2 to reference it. And so I think that Aquinas does the same thing. He's actually referencing that each moment presupposes a moment which supersedes that moment, from which you can look down and go, all right, there's T1 and T2. And if you were to go higher and higher, then you can end up basically, if you were to, I'm saying higher and higher, metaphorically, if you were to distance yourself from time, you would see it as a complete sequence, as a set. And I think that's what he's saying. But when you're in the set, the experience is radically different. Now, that's not to say that their existences are in contradiction, which is why I brought up this idea of different dimensions. And Aquinas, he doesn't think of relativity, but he does actually say dimension. He says we could propose a different dimension in the same way that we propose that heaven is above, but it's a metaphor. And I think that's exactly what he's saying, that there is this dimension in which you could see the whole, or the whole set, and that have its whole existence, but we simply aren't perceiving that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's interesting that you kind of brought, like Hegelian, insights and that sort of thing to the question of like Aquinas and the conception of time. I just thought that was interesting. This is also something that's been talked about by like philosophers Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann. They've developed this view of God's relation to time, and it is kind of like this fragmented view that we've kind of been describing. I think they call it ET simultaneity. It's called, I think that's short for like eternal temporal simultaneity, I think. And the basic idea is that they develop a kind of model on which God is in some manner simultaneous to the whole of time, as a kind of eternal being in some manner simultaneous to the whole of time. Even though you might be able to conjoin with that view that from the perspective of times, being within times, all the times aren't like simultaneous to one another, so that kind of goes back to the kind of unity that you were just proposing. So anyway, I think it's interesting that there are contemporary proponents within even analytic philosophy that are sort of developing models that are at least somewhat similar to that. That's a connection to contemporary analytic philosophy that I think is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea about analytic philosophy, so any insight on analytic philosophy is very welcome, because I am so out of the loop, it's not even funny. Like,
yeah, well, see, I just think, as you can see, there are lots of different interesting issues, and as you put it earlier, it's just mind-bending here.
Oh, it really is. It really is.
And especially when you're thinking about from the different perspectives. It's like when you make the claims, you have to kind of index it. When you make claims about what times exist, you have to index it to which perspective you're talking about. So at least from the perspective of creatures, you kind of say, well, maybe presentism is true from our perspective. But from God's perspective, you have to say maybe all times exist, they're equally real. It's one of those privileged, of course, God's perspective might be more fundamental. So is that one that we should be like discount the temporal experience as illusory? Is it not really the case that it's presentism, or is it really like a fragmented reality? Like, these are interesting questions, and I think, so long as we have the kind of fragmented reality view, I'm probably going to still go back to the original criticisms. Like, so long as we at least grant that from the perspective of creatures, there's a real sense, there is some sense in which future times don't exist from our perspective, then we're going to get the problems with like, yes, then at least minimally from our perspective, eternalism isn't true. Eternalism from our perspective. And so that's, I guess, where my issue would persist. But
yeah, maybe. I mean, like, I think, I see the point, because it appears to be fragmentary. And I guess the reason that I don't see it as such is because of this relationship in which Hegel does propose God to be, because Hegel takes God and this idea of the Christian God to be the absolute. And I think that this is a very Aristotelian notion, right? And I think people want to just say it's the Schelling. And it's like, well, where did Schelling get it from? But like a lot of the time it's like Schelling's a great guy, but he takes stuff from Fichte, and Fichte's proposing a teleological explanation of the self and of reality and that exists outside, and he brings it in. He's like, no, this telos exists within, and that's where we start ending up with this concept of the absolute sort of developing, and that's just really a reversion back to Aristotle from a post-Kantian, and I would argue anyway. And so when we look towards the absolute, what we have as it's defined, absolute spirit, and Hegel talks about it, is this unity of universality, particularity, and individuality. In terms of time, it means the universality of time, like so the eternal now, the particularity of time, the present now, and their unity in the absolute. And the unity in the absolute is to say that no, both exist equally and are mediating to sustain a logical reality, which is the individual moment. And the way I like to think of this is kind of like in the theory of relativity. If you read the theory of relativity, Einstein argues that each individual sort of moment is dependent upon a possible experience or a possible experiencer from a given position relative to other positions in time. And he doesn't reference it to just abstract beings. He actually references it like if you were perceiving at this point, and it's about perception. And I think that this is the point that Hegel's making. It is the unity of perception, both in the universality and particularity, as being the absolute. And he thinks that's essentially God. That's essentially the humanity of Christ, his individual moment in existence, the universality of the Father, and the love, the relationship between all humanity as the individual, God can see through our eyes and experience our experiences and so on, and unite us in a single whole, which is a set or a species, which then relates everything together. And then if you put all these component parts together, then you have the Trinity. You have God and that absolute experience of time, or really the absolute experience. And time, as we perceive it, we say time from the perspective of present beings moving from one moment to the next. And even in the theory of relativity, we do that. It's not until we start pointing out like different theories of when we start going, well, what if, and kind of like Aquinas with eternity, where we start going outside of time, where we start going, well, wait a minute, what if we weren't looking at this as a human and we were looking at this as an angel? And you start, even it's not God. It's not the same way in which God would perceive it. But if you're a dead human or you're an angel, you're a human in heaven. How would you perceive it? And when you start thinking of these different present experiences, then I think we have what is it sort of removes this fragmentary view. And I think that I don't know about you, but I think that I'm very much a proponent of a sort of grand unifying theory. I love that sort of thing in physics, in philosophy. I'm very much for that. And I think that that's what Aquinas is trying to do, is sort of provide this unifying theory. But, obviously I do see that there is, maybe Aquinas didn't mean that at all. And it's just a massive contradiction and he just can't resolve it. And maybe I'm reading Hegel into him. Do you know what I mean? And maybe I'm like resolving it with a different philosopher. Yeah, but I do think that from what I've read, that's the interpretation I would take.
So that's interesting. So, in order to kind of reflect on that further, I'd have to kind of look into Hegelianism more. And you've kind of whet my appetite, honestly, for that. So just because of its relation to the kind of Thomistic system now, which I hadn't been privy to before our interactions. So I think that's really interesting, and I'm just going to have to look into Hegelianism more. Honestly, that's going to be my thoughts here.
100% check out the Science of Logic, especially the Encyclopedia of Logic. It's the most well written, arguably the most up to date, although some versions of the Greater Logic also have been updated with that. But it's written towards students, so it's the most comprehensible. It's just nicer to read, in my opinion, just much nicer to read. And funnily enough, actually the just to sort of round that off, I can actually include a quote from that, which is essentially what he says about the Christian God in the Science of Logic. He says, God in the Christian religion is also known as love, because his Son, who is with him, has revealed himself to men as a man among men, and thereby redeemed them, all of which is another way of saying that the antithesis of the subjective and the objective is simply overcome, and that our affair to participate in this redemption by laying aside our immediate subjectivity, putting off the old Adam, and learning to know God as our true and essential self. And so that's the way in which he relates it to, it's we need to put Adam aside and see ourselves as Christ. And that is the development in Christianity from Judaism as well. So I think that I think that I'll leave it at that, and I'll not go too Hegelian, I'll not just, force Hegel, but I think it is a nice way of relating an Aristotelian notion of the Christian God. And, in relation to what you said about you haven't heard many people talk about that. Unfortunately, even at the Hegelian Society, it is a problem. Like what I've found is that there's not very many Hegelians who want to see Hegel as an Aristotelian in contemporary times. In history, there was a lot more that saw him as a kind of Christian, very Christian thinker, and he sometimes gets referred to as the Protestant Aquinas. So it's just that it's more of a contemporary dissatisfaction with Christianity. It's sort of fallen out of favor, and so we would rather see him as more secular, as a humanist, and so on. But
I was going to say, I thought he was a Lutheran.
Yeah, he is a Lutheran. But he loved the classics, specifically Aristotle. So he's a Lutheran who adopts Aristotle. He adopts the De Anima. He says it's the greatest work on psychology to date. He says that he adopts the three figures of logic from Aristotle. He actually steals half of his work really from Aristotle. If you know Aristotle, I'm not even the politics, the development of institutions, it's taken from Aristotle. Almost all of it's taken, like a lot of it's. He even when he talks about Aristotle, he's the greatest. He talks about the greatest philosopher. He talks about it. He named his son after Immanuel Kant, from what I'm aware. He named him Emmanuel. Which might have been after Immanuel Kant. I'm not too sure, but I have to double check.
So I do have a question. Did he kind of, in Aquinas, there's been increasing appreciation, in part due to Gavin Carrer, but there's been increasing appreciation of the kind of merging of Aristotelianism and Platonism. You have a kind of participatory metaphysics. So although a lot of people have really emphasized Aquinas' Aristotelianism, there's actually huge strands of Platonism in there. So is that also the case with Hegel? Does he kind of merge Aristotelianism?
100%. Well, I think the difference, the thing is that I think Aquinas does this too. I think they acknowledge that Aristotle agrees with Plato a lot more than people want to give Aristotle credit for. And people want to see is it's like that famous picture, right, where Aristotle pointing up. But it's that. It's not the. If he was taking the position of Heraclitus, he'd be pointing down, right? I don't know if Heraclitus would be pointing down, but if he was just saying only particulars exist, he'd be pointing down. If a nominalist would be pointing down, an empiricist, he's got the middle. It's both. It's the universal form and the particular as one. And I think that is the beauty of Aristotelianism. And I think that it's certainly more Platonic than people give it credit for. But I 100% think that Aquinas, I think McIntyre puts it as Aquinas is a better Aristotle than Aristotle.
Really appreciate this. Just for the audience, there, like we were just saying, kind of behind the scenes, there are further points of contention and further points of disagreement, but getting into those would probably take us too far afield. And also, we really enjoyed where we went so far with it. So
Yeah, it's been really great. It has been really great. Like one of the most fun conversations I've had. So yeah, like just to summarize, would you like to say who you are again, shout yourself out, just and then say anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, so I guess one final thank you for having me on and being able to talk about these things. All too often we get, we're on our computers, we don't see the other person's face, and we just type out things, we just lose humanity, basically. So we lose, we not only lose the other person's humanity, but we also in some sense lose our own humanity because we kind of just unleash, we let go, and we become these tribalistic beasts. So we lose humanity in two different senses, and that's very bad. So I think these conversations are really important and helpful to humanize the other and to see them not as the other. And so I really like that, and that's why I'm a big proponent of that, and I try to do that on my channel. So for your audience who might be more inclined to a kind of non-analytic style of philosophy, my channel hopefully can still serve them because it's, analytic philosophy to the max. But still, I think I try to help people search for truth. That's really what I'm ultimately trying to do. And yeah, the channel again is Majesty of Reason. And if they're curious to learn about these issues more, the kind of classical theistic proofs and my take on them, they can check out my book, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. It is very expensive because Springer only serves libraries, or you can buy it as an individual, but their main service is for libraries. So it's very expensive if you don't have the funds to buy it, which I hope you do. But if you don't, you can send me a message and I might be able to help you. So.
Oh, that's so lovely. You're too nice. That's really lovely. But yeah, it's been really great, and I think you're totally right as well about losing humanity. And I think even I think what you said, totally piqued the Hegelianism in us anyway, with the whole when you lose with losing the other and you lose yourself in the process. Almost, I think that's 100%. When the other becomes obscure, you revert to this sort of bestial nature. That's very Hegelian. If you like that, you'll love Hegel. That is. But yeah, like I think that's 100% it. And I think it's been a really great conversation. Really, I think it's been really like in depth. I think it's very rare that you can have these conversations. To be honest, like as a sort of academic philosopher, it's very rare that you can have a conversation which is truly titillating and not just, as I said, I think I said it earlier before, it was like just a lecture where you're lecturing someone on philosophy and you're having to explain things over and over again, and instead you can kind of like presume the other person has an understanding of the topic area that you're discussing, and you clearly do. Aquinas at least, if not better than I do, writing books on him. So it's much easier to have a conversation with being able to presume that level of knowledge. So it's been great, and yeah, like thank you again, and you're welcome to come on the channel anytime.
Awesome, thanks.
So if you'd like to learn more on philosophy, including Thomas Aquinas, I have 4 lectures on Aquinas in my course, An Introduction to Western Philosophy, and lectures on the history of philosophy as a whole, from the classical era to the contemporaries. So if that interests you, check that out in the description below. I hope you've all enjoyed this conversation. I know I have. And as always, try to gain some perspective.